Hi, everybody. My name's Talya Pardo. Welcome to Soul Speak. It is my great pleasure today to welcome David Miller. David Miller is a coach who works with couples, helping to dispel the myths around relationships. My purpose this season is to talk to coaches and people in the world about men and about the misconceptions about what it is to be masculine, about how do we learn to understand and appreciate men in relationship and in the world at large, and to help us appreciate their place, because I think that that is something that is lacking these days. So I'd like to illuminate and shed some light. So I'm going to hand it off to David to start us off, to tell us exactly about what you do and how do you work towards some of these goals.
Thank you, Taylor. This is Tyler. It's very nice to be here with you. I appreciate the opportunity. We've got in society, we've got a serious problem with relationships. The divorce rates are astounding, and the trauma, the emotional trauma that this is causing, is being passed down into children with broken homes. And you know, I guess we're going to focus mostly on the masculinity, but it's very damaging psychologically to both genders. And um, I think it's very good to talk about the masculinity, mostly because the femininity in its natural state is always beautiful. There's never anything toxic about it. It's just grace. So grace can't be toxic. Only the lack of it can be
Right.
toxic.
Yes.
And so what I do with my clients, I do work with couples, but I also work with individuals because people are trying to heal from past relationships, whether it's, well, the truth of the matter is that it goes back to our childhood. So it's not just that bad relationship we had with a partner or multiple partners over the years. It's what started when we were little, probably pre-speech for most people.
Definitely.
And the damage causes this, try to choose my words carefully so I'm not being offensive, but it's actually a concept of trauma. The
Okay.
trauma is experienced as very real, but it's not real. Once you've healed, you can see that it was never real. It was merely a misperception of the mind. And so that is the main focus of my work. But to get people to recognize their nature and where they're suffering, um, it seems that focusing on the nature of human beings' natural um, polarity with the
Mhm.
masculine and the feminine traits that we have as human beings, um, it really helps us understand ourselves so that we can notice the way that we're behaving in a very subtle but deep manner, so that we can be excuse me, we can be responsible for it. if we
Yes.
don't if we don't know how we're being, we just can't be responsible for anything, truly.
Absolutely. Yeah. I agree. And the way you describe trauma, I said that myself, in that it's not always a a catastrophic traumatic experience that causes trauma. It's in our childhood innocence, and vulnerability, how we interpret events around us and how we perceive them as related to us, that creates a traumatic emotional a wound. And so it's never to trivialize anyone's experience or to say that trauma isn't real, but it's like you said, it's how we've experienced it. And so it can be healed with shifts of perception and also better understanding the people around us, right? Like I see that very clearly. You're expressing quite a lot of my own approach and what I've learned in my own journey
I
about
should
how to
qualify.
change. Yeah.
I just let me interrupt because
Yeah,
I want to
please.
qualify something. There is physical trauma.
Yes,
That is always a different thing other than emotional
absolutely.
trauma. So
Yes, that's without
when you
question.
yeah, when your body's physically violated, whether it's an accident, like an act of nature, a poor choice that we make ourselves, or something that's done to us,
Yes,
those that lands in a different way than the psychological and emotional mental
absolutely.
trauma that
Absolutely. It's a different animal in itself.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, for us to deal with. Yeah. I think, when we're talking, so many of us are traumatized in different ways. Um, and when it comes to relationships, we're often reliving or reacting out so many of those scenes or patterns
mm,
into relationship completely unconsciously, right? That's part of it. And so the seeking to better understand yourself is part of the healing process. So tell us a little bit about what maybe what the men who come to you are really struggling to deal with or understand.
yeah. That's a beautiful topic. It boils down to mostly to shame and guilt. So I'm 55 years old right now, and so I watched the women's liberation movement form and take hold and run ramshot through society from a very young age. I watched how it affected my own mom, who was not she wasn't like a devout follower of that, but it influenced her. Like I can see it clearly in hindsight as an adult, but I noticed it energetically as a child. I was very sensitive, so I could feel people's energy, and I knew that she was changing and I didn't understand why, but I understood the consequences of those changes and how it
Okay.
affected our home. Um, but like I say, the details of that come easily in hindsight. So um, she became more masculine and she lost her true essence. And my dad was no angel, but
Mm,
he became very affected by this in a seriously negative way. Um, he made some really poor choices that hurt her badly. But it's when you're looking at the story, it's always like, well, who's at fault? Like
mm,
that's the human nature is to go into fault, and that
yeah.
points at blame or guilt or shame. And so he made some poor choices. We could call them mistakes um, that emasculated him, but he was being emasculated by this shift in consciousness. Every man on the planet was, and so I grew up learning that being emasculated is what it is to be a man.
Oh,
That's the only example I had.
right.
There, there was men that I would notice, like maybe uh, a friendly acquaintance's dad, who was um, more. Well, I'll say less. I was going to say more something else, but I'll choose the words less emasculated than my dad.
Mm,
But he was so guys like that were so coarse and abrasive. It was like they didn't really know their hearts at all. But I think now as an adult, I can see that they were closing their hearts out of protection of themselves.
right.
And
They saw the attack on their own essence.
yeah, and there's an element to being masculine that really needed to be checked by women, because if women hadn't sort of banded together and rose up and fought the good fight, then that element of masculinity that is toxic would have never been checked because men don't have a reason to.
So tell me, what do you mean when you say the element that is toxic? Like how describe what that manifests as or what qualities that is.
Well, when it's human nature for everyone to have an ego where it's built into
Mm.
the human condition. Um, so when we, some people have a bigger ego than others, but part of this, part of the trouble with ego with men is that we, we don't need women to survive. We need women to procreate. So on our own, we can hunt and gather and fight and survive. It's not a very pleasant existence.
No,
Thank you to all the women for that.
right.
Like, I mean, it's not a very graceful existence to always be in that masculine state,
Mm,
but we can. And
right,
so when a man um, isn't shown empathy and compassion as and taught that as an example of a way to be in life, he could easily pick up a tendency to just run ramshot over anybody that's weaker than him.
right.
And so
It's
that,
the exaggerated state. Yeah.
yeah. And so, a lot of that gets justified in, well, I'm protecting and I'm providing. I have to be dominant
Mm,
to do my job, to play my role properly as a man. But it crosses a line from being um, devotionally and honorably dominant, which is inclusive of everybody's autonomy and self authority and agency, into becoming domineering, which is
two different.
tyrannical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And so to go back to where we were in that at the time, masculinity needed a little check from the women, right? From women that they were maybe crossing the lines into domineering and to
Yeah.
remember. Yeah. Yeah. But I feel that while it started off with good intentions, it itself crossed the lines and had no balance in itself and no boundaries and went completely in the opposite direction and caused quite a lot of harm. The
Yeah.
way I see it, yeah. From what I've seen in my own sphere, my own family, my own, circle of friends, what I've seen, I don't see where it has helped either sex, frankly. In so many ways. At least speaking as a woman, I was brought up in a very liberal household. And my mother worked and, both parents worked and all of that. But what I saw was my mother entirely overwhelmed because she worked full time and had two kids and was 100% responsible for everything in the household. And my father was in his own extreme masculinity. He's a very masculine man, right? Worked, provided, but that was life. There was very, very little room for connecting, for balancing out and enjoying both sides, like both parents in a non-stressful state, right? So his entire focus was nothing is more important than providing, even if it means I have very little relationship with the people I'm providing for. And my mother was in the state of responsibility for everything, leading to her own overwhelm. And that just, permeated the household as well. So neither side really got the benefits of what was intended, I think, from the original movement.
Yeah. And I'm about to say something and I really need it to not be taken as blame because it's not. It's
Mhm.
just what you described is probably, I think, almost everybody in, at least in the West and North America, probably Europe as well, can relate to what you just described. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm blaming women, because it was what you just shared is a was a matter of circumstance.
Mhm.
And so it's not like it's the women's fault. It's just how it became.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
I don't, and I think blame isn't going to get us anywhere at this point, right?
No,
Neither blaming men for creating the atmosphere that women felt they needed to push back on or stand up for, and neither women for, the pendulum swinging in the other direction. There's no room for blame, because it's not going to heal anything, right? It's
yeah,
just, here's where we are, and how can we rebalance and make each part of the population feel their know their worth, feel their value, feel fulfilled in who they are meant to be, right? And understand that we complement each other, and so we can value the qualities that we each bring to the table, without saying, well, you do this and it's not like how I do it, so I don't support it, or you know I can't
right,
abide by it. Yeah.
right. Because that's especially not going to work with men, because we need the masculinity in men. Well, masculinity in either gender, any gender, is based on logic and reason and consciousness, and um, you know, just getting stuff done. And there has to be purpose and planning, and maybe some passion mixed in there, but that's a little bit more feminine. And men have that. We all have both masculine and feminine traits, but um, focusing on the masculine side for men, with this idea that we can just have our way, that's always lingering in the shadow.
Okay.
But the most impressive thing for me in my life and my healing was to realize that it's not all about me. And that started when I had and sadly for my ex-wife, that started when I had children. So I was with her for quite a long time. Let's do the math. I think it was 12 or 13 years I was with this woman. She was like my teenage sweetheart. Um, and then we got married and started having children. And that's when I realized it's not just about me.
Hmm. Well,
Because
having children will do that to all of, well, hopefully all of us, right? Most of us. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so that brings up, an opening of the heart to be more inclusive of another being's autonomy. And it takes, for men, I'm using the children as an example because some men don't have children, but when a man falls in love with a woman, like when he finds that that beautiful soul, and his heart just opens, and there's no way he has no control over it. It just happens. He might know a lot of women, he might have been with a bunch of women trying to figure things out, but eventually a special woman's going to come into every man's life, and he's going to hurt her. And I mean, I hope that for everybody that that's not physical. I mean mentally and emotionally, because he's not going to understand that she's not him, and that
Huh.
he can't just treat her like one of the boys. She's got these feminine traits, and they're not certainly not fragile in a sense of physically fragile, but the feminine energy needs to be nurtured. It needs to be held safely because it's wide open. It can be easily damaged and abused because it's wide open to receive.
That's right.
So when a man doesn't understand that, and he acts out of innocence because he doesn't know, he's not consciously aware enough to be responsible in any other way.
Right.
He acts out and he hurts the woman that he loves, and it's that moment when a man realizes that he needs to be different, he needs to be more inclusive, and he starts looking at himself and trying to figure out why and how, like
Right.
what needs to be done so that I never do that again. And
Yeah.
the only way that a woman can affect that change is to stay in her grace when she gets hurt. Because if she gets
Huge.
masculinized by the pain,
Mm-hmm.
where she believes she needs to protect herself
Mm-hmm.
rather than have faith that he will change and he will protect her. And I know these are controversial words. Like I know where this is going to land for a lot of people, but if you sit with it, it's the only way that a woman can affect real change in a man.
Well,
And
it,
and I'm not suggesting that a woman stay in an abusive situation,
never. Yes.
but yeah, never. Thank you for using that word.
What I
But
what I think you're saying is that the woman in her grace needs to give the man the room to understand and change without berating and barraging
mhm,
and trying to kind of like herd him in that direction.
right.
It's here's where this didn't work for me, or here's where this went wrong, or here's where this hurt me.
Yeah, and how
You
does it
need to
make you
understand.
feel?
Yeah. Yeah.
How does it make you feel? Like, that's, to be straight, that's the only thing a man needs to know. He can see with his own eyes that
Yeah.
he's hurt you, and he's aware of it, and his conscience will immediately kick in. There's this thing that the mind does called cognitive dissonance, where it will try to wash away responsibility, it'll try to wash away
Mhm.
awareness. But but when a man loves you and he knows, like, he's it's gonna, it it can actually feel like a punch in the gut. It hits hard, and in the willpower, in the power center. So
Yeah.
he's immediately aware that he's emasculated himself,
Mhm.
and because the nature of a man is to protect and provide for those that can't.
Right.
Like we say, the women and the children. That's not true. Women can protect and provide for themselves, but it's just kind of like an, Neanderthal nature, kind of like going back to the primal nature of human
Yep.
beings. It's built into our DNA.
Absolutely.
And
We're
so,
still
like,
wired for that psychologically and physiologically. We're still wired for those times, but we're just living in a modern environment. But
yeah,
our brains are trying to work out fulfilling what we're wired to do within this new setting, right? Like there's no mastodons or saber-toothed tigers to go out to hunt or protect from, right? But the man is seeking to still protect within this changed atmosphere or circumstance.
yeah. And the thing
Yeah.
is that in Neanderthal times, it was simple. It was, you might have to have a war with another tribe. You might have to, you know, listen to the elders so that you were following a, a path, like a nomad path where there will be food. There's all of that primal stuff to basic survival stuff. Now, basic survival stuff is work. You either have your own business or you have a job. And
Mhm.
if you're a man that is an employee, well, even if you have your own business, it can be just a job.
Mhm.
And even though you're the boss and you're able to make the decisions, a lot of people create businesses where they feel just as downtrodden as they would if they had a job with somebody else. And what this causes is a state of servitude in men.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so there's a nobility in performing that servitude when you have children who need their mom to stay at home. Like I'm thinking back, into the 1950s and previous,
Yeah,
when one income could afford a home and a nice new car.
right.
Um, so there's this instinct to provide, and the way society is now, that's been turned into something that is very taxing. It's brutal. So a man isn't fighting a saber-toothed tiger, but he's fighting for that middle management position. He's going to work and he's fighting every day in his own
And
way.
that's a less visible battle too,
Yeah.
right? The saber tooth, you come home with your scars or you don't come home at all, kind of, right? With those in that primitive situation. But in these days, and I've, speaking from my own learned experience as well, right? I see my man going out to work and it's a battle. He says, I'm going out to the battle, but if I allow myself to drop my own awareness, right? My heightened awareness around our energies, I can very easily forget that he's going out to fight, right? That's how he feels every day. And when he comes home, he feels he's come home from a battle. And so
Yeah.
that to remember that at least in our, I welcome him home from the battle. I make a point of giving him that so that he feels he fought today. He fought like another day for here's his reward. He walks into a house with a partner who's smiling and happy to greet him and is grateful he's come home and is it can so easily be twisted to be demeaning, right? But it's not because it's given with my own open heart and my love for him to recognize his contribution and what his efforts mean, right? It can easily be like, you waited at the door for your husband in the old 1950s, the way that modern day feminism has twisted that to be demeaning to women. And it's so not when it's embodied with love and appreciation for who they are, right? For who he is. It's
I,
if
I,
anything, it heightens the joy, right? Or it heightens the love. So
that's
it really,
that.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's very easy to forget that it is a battle because it's not a visible battle to us.
Yeah. Yeah, the scars aren't there.
Yeah.
Um, but the wounds get cut open on a regular basis, and what you described is just pure graciousness. It's gratitude, it's appreciation, it's the opposite of taking for granted.
Yes. And that's another, malady I think that a lot of relationships suffer. We forget that the other person needs that. And as women too, we want that to know visually or feel that appreciation and know that we're
Mhm.
not just taking it for granted that you go out and you come home okay and what you didn't pick up the milk and we can get mired in those moments but it makes the other person feel that all that they've done to get to the front door has been forgotten. And
It's
Grace, I love that you started out this conversation also talking about the grace of femininity because that's something that women and I'm going to ask you if that's what you also when you're working with couples or with other women talk about because that's not always something that comes so easily to women. I guess even in the modern day, even myself, I've had to learn to be mindful, to be gracious, because I've lived so many years in a very defensive, hectic masculine space, right? That in this relationship, I've had to learn to remind myself that grace is things go so well when there's graciousness, and it's not out of putting myself down, it's out of stepping into the energy that is most authentic and flows for this for the house, for the relationship, for the interaction, because then it inspires his masculine to be in its most purest form, and
Yeah.
it drives nicely. It really does. Yeah, but it's not something that I see in a lot of women come easily.
No, it's the way things are now. Um, Truly gracious women are rare. And I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm picking on women. It's just everybody has moments of grace. But when we get caught up in the turmoil of life and women are going out to work to survive, um, which just by the nature of work, um, I mean, just by the nature of a job, not work, but a job, you're forced into performing with your masculine traits,
Absolutely.
and then that that's very draining to a naturally feminine woman. Um, it causes different hormones.
Hmm.
So now there's a physical effect on the body. It's not just an energetic or a mental emotional thing. It becomes a physical thing, which can affect health.
Yeah. Oh,
And,
absolutely. Yeah.
and so women become drained in multiple ways. They become overburdened, and then when they get home, the home, like my home is my safe space. It's I made my space what I wanted it to be, and I don't let just anybody into my home. There's an
Yeah.
energy here that is so peaceful and so harmonious and serene that it's sacred,
Yeah.
and I look after that. That's my job. So I take that seriously. But when you have two people working hard and they're both in servitude, um, oftentimes resentment and bitterness can come into that picture. Maybe she
Mm.
wishes she didn't have to work, but she can't. That's not realistic. So she tries to bottle that up, and it gets pushed down, but then it starts to bubble out. It starts to burst out, and things get said. And now the guy's coming home. He's in servitude instead of being in honorable service. He's in servitude, and it's not good enough. And he gets
Mm.
told that he needs to do better. And it can just be a look. It can
Yeah.
just be like a subtle word that gets said in a moment of discomfort. But
Mm.
in 1,000 or 10,000 ways, men are told that they're not good enough. And even though they're pushing themselves beyond what feels right for them, like they're in their soul,
Yeah.
so they get this is where anger and resentment comes up. It's like, this sense that maybe their woman is feeling entitled to something that is torture for him.
Mm.
And and then, when the graciousness is gone, home isn't a safe spot anymore. So he comes home to where he needs to recharge to be able to go out and do it again the next day, and he can't even do that because he's being told it wasn't good enough. It's being told he needs to change, and the resentment and the anger builds up, and that primal urge to just run ramshot over everybody starts to kick in, and then he has to bottle that up, and he's probably been taught that he shouldn't feel that way, so guilt and shame come into it,
Yeah.
and and then the possibility of change is very difficult at that point, until like I can help people through that, because I can show them as they're telling me their problems. I can point at things. I can say, okay, this is what you're experiencing because, and I open up their consciousness and I bring their awareness to the cause while they're focusing on the effects.
Yeah.
And bring the focus to the cause gives room for healing, gives room for
Yeah.
change. And so people always wonder how I can show a woman what grace is, and it's because I have a feminine heart.
Mm.
I have a very gracious part of my being. It's only it's less than it's a much lower percentage than my masculinity, but it's well established, and I know it. So I know what grace is, and I've lived with a very gracious woman. I've held grace in my arms, and it's an unmistakable thing. You can't mistake it for something else once you know it, once you've
Yeah.
experienced it here within and without.
And so
So
how do we guide more women to understand that grace is not demeaning to them or does not diminish. If anything, it adds, it builds them up and adds rather than takes away, because I know that in this society it is not seen as positive virtue, right? Grace in a woman, right? How do we do that? Because there, and in conversation with even friends or even in different support groups, what I've realized and I've learned is that sometimes, we'll say, well, how come he doesn't do this? Or, in the regular conversation of like, he has to do this and he has to do that, and understand that sometimes it's, and as you've laid out here, the first step to change comes from us, and it's not always fair if we want to put it in modern, these days, it's like not fair that I have to do all this first. Why can't he step up first? Because we lead with our being, and so when our being shifts, that creates the ripple and the opening for the reciprocal shift. So how do we support women to understand that it's okay to be, first of all, to be the first one, right? Or to take the first step to make those changes?
mm,
And how do we understand that it's not diminishing us by being gracious, if at all?
I love that part of the question a lot. That
I'm glad you
part,
do.
I'm a big man. I lived my life in the building trades. Most of my existence
Mm,
was spent working with my hands, with the guys in the plaid shirts and the cussing and the beer and the like the
right.
manly man stuff. And sometimes these guys get pushy.
Mm,
Sometimes like I, I've spent a lot of time with guys who think it's fun to have a fist fight with their friends.
right.
Okay, like
Yeah.
I wasn't quite that hardcore, but I know that feeling. And these guys think they have power. Look how strong I am. I go to the gym and I know I can punch harder than you. That's not power. I'm envious of women because my natural state, even though I've embodied my grace completely, it's only maybe, if I was to put a number to it, it's only maybe 15% of my being. Where women can make it probably 85% of their being. And it is the most powerful thing in the human experience. Grace is the most powerful thing. And so when a woman chooses to be masculine, and I know it's not a conscious choice most of the time, but it is still a choice. It's when she falls from grace.
Mm.
And and I look at it now after, obviously I couldn't see back when I needed to focus on myself to heal myself. But now I look at it and I'm like, oh, if you only knew. So I start pointing out, I introduce them to grace. I get them to stop. Just stop everything. Just stop and feel into your body. What is that feeling? And I can, when I'm working with somebody, I can tell what they feel in their body. So I can go that right there. As soon as they as soon as they step into their grace, I feel it. And I
Amazing.
don't even have to be in your presence.
Mm.
I can be on the other side of the world. And I just go, that's your grace. And then everybody's like, well, I know that feeling. Of course because everybody knows it.
Yeah.
But we get lost in our mind. We get lost in the turmoil of suffering.
Yeah.
And so I bring them to that peace and I point at it and so that they have an opportunity to become intimate with it. And
Yeah.
then you can choose. It's
Yeah.
it takes your own masculine essence. So we were going to focus on masculinity. So
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
wonderful because
Yeah.
a woman needs her masculine essence to provide herself with the consciousness to become body aware. That's
Hmm.
masculine.
Yeah.
And then once your body awareness is showing you, I'm not comfortable, I'm tight, I'm agitated, whatever it is, in that moment, then you can choose from a place of responsibility, which is still masculine,
Yeah.
to relax, to
Mm.
just stop holding that tension, because whatever made you tense wasn't real. There is no saber-toothed tiger. Now, maybe if you were walking down a dark alley and there was some nefarious people and you were actually in potential danger, then there's a good reason for your body to be tense. But if you're not in that danger anymore, you can let that go. You can just let it go. It's a choice, and it's an energetic release of the energy comes from thoughts that come from beliefs, and those beliefs are always based on fear, and every single one of them is a deception.
Yes. Yes. And we give meaning because of their past experiences. We give a lot of meaning to comments or things that are said in conversations that then stimulate those thoughts to go in a particularly negative, direction, which affirms the beliefs that we have about um, how safe we are, or what might happen to us, or who the other person is in our own mind, and that feeds the fear, right? It's the ascribing meaning to things that are not don't mean that. But for us in our perception, we create a story around it that
And the
always leads
world
to fear. Right?
and the world gives a reflection to witness that story. So
Yeah.
if a woman says I love you to a man, but then she openly and outwardly disrespects him by emasculating him, by accusing him of being um, dangerous when he's not hurting her. What's wrong with being dangerous if I'm not hurting you?
No, it's like Jordan Peterson actually said the best thing about men and being dangerous is that men need to, a good man is one who can be dangerous when the situation is called for, but knows how to restrain himself and, you know, maintain the threat of danger so that that's part of his protection. But
Yeah.
a man who is either still juvenile or immature or undeveloped in his masculinity will be dangerous and not be able to control that. Right. So
Right.
there's the difference, right? We need men to have the capability to be dangerous, but to also know when it's appropriate and when it's meant to be used, and how to even use the fact that others know they can be dangerous without having to lift a finger, just to
Yeah.
embody that energy as their way of maintaining security and order around them.
I, as I did my own healing work, I had to face a lot of those places in my psyche where I was dangerous and not in control of it.
Mm.
Fortunately, I never acted out and never, I'm really grateful for that because I could have.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, but once I realized that I had this capability of like murder,
Mm.
like I realized I'm capable of murder.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of circumstance. Like I certainly don't want to be that way, but push me, push me. Go ahead and see what happens.
Right. Threaten my family, threaten my home, threaten my own safety and that of
Threaten
my
my
loved
children.
ones. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and so when a man gets to that place where he's more than capable to die for who he loves, who
Yeah.
there's an energy to that that is something you don't want to mess with. And at the same time, it's love,
Yeah. It
right?
is. Yeah.
And you know, when I started looking at myself in that way, I realized I'm capable of killing another human being in a state of love.
Well, and we can compare that to grace, right? Grace is also a state of love if we want
Yeah,
to, and those are the two embodiments, strength and grace of the two the polarities of the energies. It still always comes back to love. There's no malice in
yeah.
there. It's love. And so it's not demeaning and um it's not out to hurt anybody. It has to come from love.
And that state of love is the state of grace is what would keep me from going too far if I ever had to physically hurt someone to make them stop.
Yeah.
You know that
Yeah.
because this is going to stop when you stop
Yeah.
because you were incorrect. What you were doing shouldn't be. It's not inclusive.
Yeah.
You weren't
Yeah.
including the other person as an equal.
Yeah,
So there's
and
no.
and I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that's often a dynamic in a couple during an argument, right? And often, and not to stereotypic, not to be stereotypical, but often it's the woman who will continue to barrage verbally, right? And the man who just needs this needs to stop, right? They can usually hold themselves until it reaches a certain point, and then things escalate because we've gone beyond reasonable dialogue, reasonable, and then, everybody's now living in their own traumas or their own suffering and reacting from that and not anymore in the present. And
Yeah,
that's where the dysfunction comes in because the woman has stepped into her masculine, the man is feeling emasculated, and defensive reactions are going off like bombs, basically.
yeah. Now, if that was two men, if it
Right, that would
wasn't
be a
a
whole other story. Yeah,
right, so
yeah,
if that was two men, then the one who's getting violated could solve the problem with his fist.
yeah,
But
yeah.
we don't hit women,
We hope
and
not. Yeah,
so
no,
that's
generally
that
no. Yeah,
that's where that behavior that you describe so well is seriously violating to a man
yeah,
because he's not. What is he to do? He's being faced with masculinity from another human being, that is violating him, but he can't punch that person to make them stop. It's
Yeah.
brutal.
It's important. You know what? And we're coming to the end. I could talk to you, I think, for the rest of the day about this because it's such a great and such a deep topic. There's so many layers to it. But I think this is a good place to start to wrap it up because this is a place where that's what a part of what I, really wanted out of this conversation is to verbalize to women what we need to understand about men. And there's so much, so it's not contained within 1 hour, but this point that you made in the dynamics of a relationship, in a disagreement, a woman's how she conducts herself will directly impact how her man reacts, right? And what it makes him feel and how any, resolution or non-resolution comes out of that. There's so many couples who have explosive fights, right? And it damages the relationship, and they may be able to come back and repair afterwards, but there's emotional currency that's spent there, and things end up escalating beyond reasonable, reasonability or proportional to the topic, even, right? And it creates dysfunctional patterns and loops in a relationship that don't need to be there. If one side can start at least better understanding the other, that's already the first start, right? So that's a great place to start to conclude here.
Yeah, I could go on and on myself. Would you like me to share one other really important realization?
Yes, absolutely, please. Yes.
Okay, and it's kind of controversial. It's hard to talk about, but
Okay.
it's it's life changing.
Okay.
Um, so a woman's sexual center um, and her physical sexual parts, the vagina, is a yin center in a female body. It's a receptive feminine yin energy,
Yeah.
whereas a man's sexual parts are yang.
Yeah.
They're protruding, they're penetrating.
Yeah.
When what women don't understand about men is that our hearts, the
Mm.
seat of our soul, is our yin center.
Mm.
And so when
Mm.
when a woman acts in the way that you were describing earlier with her masculinity
Mm.
in an aggressive domineering way, she's actually energetically and emotionally raping the man's heart.
Mm.
And a man who loves you is going to stand there in front of you trying to keep his heart open because he knows you're hurting. He cares for you, he loves you. So he's doing his best to keep his heart open to you while it's getting raped.
Mm. That's
And
huge.
it's huge, and women don't understand that, and they think, well, he's a big man, he should be able to take that. Well,
Mm.
why should he have to? If we're
Well,
all responsible for our emotions, like if I say
mm.
to I say to women all the time just to try and get them to jolt them back into grace is like, if you feel that way about him, like if you're in a position where you need to say these things about him, why are you with him?
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
yeah. And also as a reminder, I mean that explanation is a wonderful reminder that men's hearts are just as sensitive, right? They don't demonstrate it or show it as much necessarily, and we can argue whether that's society or culture or nature that has guided them in that way, but they hurt just as much as we do. We just forget,
mm,
right? Or we don't realize and ascribe maybe a more stoic or less expressive man to be just as less sensitive.
yeah,
I know that. I mean, my fiance is very, very stoic. It's very hard to read him. But I've learned that that doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot going on in there. And I have to remind myself often to be sensitive and aware that he's a person with a quite a huge heart and a wonderful heart. He just doesn't show it on his face the way I do with my expressions and my, where
Yeah,
women are just that much more, we're out. We show it outwards. Men just, they keep it in, but it doesn't mean that it isn't there. And that's
right.
actually a perfect note to end on, even better than the one before, is a reminder for all of us that men have wonderful hearts and we need to guard them and be gentle with them as well. Yeah,
Yeah, because we want to use our power of protecting to protect you and not our hearts.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
this is
you so
great.
much.
David, this is amazing. This, thank you so, so much for this conversation. I really was so powerful for me. I'm positive, powerful for our audience. And, maybe we can have another conversation on these lines and pick it up again in a few months. That would be wonderful.
Anytime you want. Anytime you
Thank
want.
you. Thank you so much. And why don't you just on a final note, just let everybody know how they can get in touch with you or where they can find you
Oh,
if they want to reach out.
yeah. My business is called Relationships Realities, relationshiprealities.com. The website's under construction right now. We're making some changes, so but that won't take long. And then you can find me on Facebook. David Miller is my personal page. That's where I do most of my interacting with people, and I share a lot of insights on how men can return back to their natural state and how women can return back to their natural state, and just it's a good platform for exposing my service.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I hope you reach out to David, everybody, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram as well, Talia Pardo, and my website is phoenixrisingmentoring.com. Thank you so much again for being here, and I hope to speak to you again soon. This was really so powerful and profound. Thank you.
Thank you. See you
Thank
later.
you. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.